Hello, guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Skills and Abilities. I got Mr. Dusty Chonky Boy here. Will you figure out your life? Figure out your whole life. You can't lay behind me. I'm gonna squish you. That's not how it works, sir. You gotta find the good spot. Don't find the silly spot. Today we're going to be talking about one of the last lightning sorceress abilities, which is Nova. So Nova is an interesting one. It's also a very difficult one to build. I would caution most players against trying to do a Nova build without good knowledge of the game, because Nova is not very forgiving. First off, Nova doesn't really do very good damage. All right, even when maxed out, even when it's in its most optimal state, Nova's damage output is subpar in comparison to most other abilities when it comes to single target damage. Nova is a ability that hits everything around you in a circle, and because of this, the damage output has to be kind of moderately lower than other abilities. To give you an example, I'm going to go ahead and max out the synergies and the damage output for Nova, and then I'm also going to max out the damage output and synergies for something like lightning. Now, of course, I can't really do all of them. Let me reset the character here real quick so I can try and get all of this. But I'm probably not going to be able to do all of it. Let me pick something that doesn't have as many synergies. So Charge Bolt doesn't have as many synergies. Let's use that one. Alright, so maxing out Lightning Mastery is mandatory for both of them. We're going to max out Charge Bolt, and then we're going to max out Lightning. Alright, so we have maxed out Charge Bolts, and Charge Bolt does a damage output of 342 to 364 damage with 24 bolts. So to give you an idea of how much damage that actually does, we have to multiply it out. So we got to take our 342 plus our 364, and then we have to divide by 2, which is going to give us an average damage of 352 times 24 bolts, which can all hit the target at the same time, which is a total damage output of 8,472 damage per cast, which is pretty ridiculous. It's a very nice damage output skill. It's what's called a shotgun skill. And of course, this can go a lot higher than this. But for the sake of today's video, we're just going to be looking at them at the identical level, which is level 31 and level 31. All right, Nova, on the other hand, does a single target damage output of 2,356. Plus 3,162 divided by 2, which is an average damage of 2,759. As you can see, Charge Bolts wins in single target damage by far. It is way better for doing a single target attacks. The thing is that Nova's not about single target damage. Nova is about multi-target damage. It's about hitting everything on the screen for a small amount of damage instead of hitting one thing on the screen for a huge amount of damage. All right, this means that the Nova Sorceress is a sorceress that excels at farming large groups of monsters, not single monsters. To give you a more succinct example, let's say it takes you 10 seconds on a Nova Sorceress to kill a single monster. Well, then it takes you 10 seconds to kill 5 monsters, and it will take you 10 seconds to kill 10 monsters, and it will take you 10 seconds to kill 20 monsters. It doesn't matter how many monsters are on the screen because you're hitting everything at the same time. And this is the important thing about Nova. It's not a single target damage ability. It is a AoE damage ability, which means that most of the time when you are fighting single target monsters like Uber Diablo, Pandemonium Diablo, Uber Mephisto, Uber Baal, Baal himself, Uber Duriel, Lilith, Uber Iswal, targets that tend to have very tanky HP that are not, of course, large groups of monsters. This is where the character kind of doesn't excel. You're going to have trouble here. And God, I hate Dark Lancers, man. The Dark Lancers are always so mean. I'm not even set up properly. I don't even have any points in vitality. They'd be all stab me in the face. I don't like it. Now, if you take your Nova Sorceress out and you actually go to user, one thing you're going to notice is that you're going to burn through mana like ridiculously fast. It doesn't take very long before you realize that literally all the mana in your bar is going to be gone just insanely fast in literally just seconds. Now, why is that specifically? Well, it has to do with the fact that Nova has an increasing mana cost, and it also starts at a really high level already. And this is something that we need to talk about. So even at level 1, the mana cost for Nova is 13. Most sorceresses at level freaking 12, when they finally get this ability, are not going to be able to cast Nova more than a couple times with a mana cost of 13 per cast. And as you level it up, it just continually increases in mana cost to the point of absurdity. And in fact, once you max it out, which I'm not even maxed out, by the way, but once I have it maxed out on this character at level 31, we're talking about a 43 mana cost per cast, which is just dumb stupid. You need a relatively large amount of mana to be able to support Nova as a skill. And to make matters even worse, the best way to use Nova is to get a large amount of faster cast. Usually between, I believe it's between the 105 breakpoints and the 200 breakpoint, I believe is where most Nova Sorceresses end up. Let me double check here because I don't want to give out wrong information. But the Sorceresses breakpoints are 142 for... No, that's FHR. Yes. Well, 78 for the 13 frame. That's lightning, chain lightning, so that's wrong. 105. Yes, I did remember correctly. So 105 is the 8 frame, and 200% is the 7 frame. So the high mana cost of this is further complicated by the fact that one of the main ways that you can increase the damage output of this ability is to cast it faster, which means that you're burning more mana. And it just gets ridiculous. We're talking about a mana cost consumption rate of, at 8 frames, let's do 8 frames, not the 7 frame, which is even worse, by the way. But let's go ahead and run this mana cost consumption calculation. So if we have currently we have a mana cost of 43 per cast, right? We can cast once every 8 frames. It's 25 frames per second, right? So we divide 25 by 8, and we get 3.125 per second. So if we cast Nova at our maximum frame rate casting speed, which of 105, we are looking at 43 times 3.125. So we can just multiply that, which means that we have an average consumption of 134.3 per second, which is kind of insane when you think about it. We're burning literally 134 mana per second when we cast Nova. Now, it gets even worse when you have 7 frame. So if you take your 25 and you divide that by 7 frame, that is 3.57, which multiplied by 43 gets you 153.5 mana per second, which means that this build has to be supported by some pretty hefty mana regeneration abilities. First off, I would definitely recommend Warmth, at least 1 point in Warmth, if not more, but it gets even spicier than that because Warmth by itself isn't enough either. So the way that mana regeneration works is that the more mana you have, the faster it regens. Regeneration on its own is actually kind of useless if you don't actually have a good mana pool to regen from. If you're going to do a Nova Sorceress, I would probably recommend at least about 1,000 mana or higher in your mana pool so that you're regenerating quickly enough to compensate for the ridiculous amount of mana that you're burning per second every single time you cast Nova. Another very interesting way to build Nova Sorceresses is to build an Energy Shield Sorceress. And the reason why you do this is because Energy Shield Sorceresses focus on having very large mana pools. And this means that you will definitely have a very large mana pool. You're going to be focusing on things like Warmth for regeneration as well. And usually when you build Energy Shield Sorceresses, you tend to have a near infinite supply of mana. And this is the reason why Nova Energy Shield Sorceresses tend to work so well together synergistically, because number one, you really kind of have to get in there to use the ability, and number two, you really need a large amount of mana, which is the same thing that you build with Energy Shield. So a common Nova build is actually building 20 static, 20 Nova, 20 lightning mastery, 20 telekinesis, and then whatever you have left over goes into energy shield. Whether or not you're going to do the immortal sorceress or not that's up to you. But basically, you definitely want to max out telekinesis first, though, because that gives you the very nice conversion rate. You can see right now it says mana consumed per damage is 200%. However, as I level up telekinesis, you'll notice it goes down to 163, 138, 113, 94, and eventually it gets to the point where it is at a 75% damage consumed, or mana consumed per damage, which basically means that you get more out of energy shield than you would normally. 1 point in energy shield is actually pretty worthless, because not only does it consume terrible amounts of mana, but it also consumes twice the amount of mana that it would otherwise. So always focus on telekinesis first if you're going for that kind of build, and then focus on energy shield afterward. Nova also has the synergy with static field, and so it's important to talk about static field within this topic. So anytime that you're utilizing Nova in a difficult situation, so we're not talking about normal difficulty, like as a high-level sorceress. Like if you're going back and you're farming normal, if you're going back and you're farming nightmare, Nova's probably going to be higher damage. But when you're in hell difficulty and you're fighting monsters that have particularly high HP, it's actually higher damage output to utilize static field than it is to utilize Nova. Now, the reason why this is because when you're running around and you're actually killing things, what you're going to notice is that static field does a massive amount of damage per hit, up to the point where it stops doing damage. This is because it hits everything on the screen, first off, and because it hits everything on the screen, you can literally static everything down to a very nice level, and then come in with your Nova and dish out pretty good damage to everything in return. Now, the exact number of hits is probably something that is calculated based on the monster's HP and some other variables, as well as the fact that the amount of damage that static field does goes down with each particular hit, because it's not based off of the individual, like the maximum HP of the monster. It's always based off of the current HP of the monster. So as the monster's HP goes down, static field's effect also goes down with it. Which means that usually, I can say this without a shadow of a doubt, the first cast of static field is always going to be more damage than Nova. But only the first one. And then depending on how much HP the monsters have, depending on what difficulty you're in, where you're running, there's a lot of different factors that go into it. The second and third cast may be more damage than Nova as well. The other important thing is that even if the damage is not higher than Nova, you'll notice a big disparity between the range of Nova versus the range of static field. Static field, when it's maxed out, will literally hit the entire screen and all the monsters on it, whereas Nova is only going to hit the monsters within your immediate area. So you can always static monsters outside of the radius of the Nova, and this comes into really big damage numbers. If you're going to be a Nova Sorceress, I definitely recommend always utilizing static field. Because number one, you maxed it out as a synergy anyway, so you already have a ridiculously high level of it. You already have negative lightning resistance, you're already utilizing huge amounts of faster cast, which allows you to cast spells at ridiculous speeds. It also costs less mana than Nova as well, which is another very big thing here. So when you are a Nova Sorceress, you always want to do something like this. 1, 2, spam. That's pretty much your goal. 1, 2, spam. Those first two casts of static field are going to dish out more damage than Nova ever will. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth cast of static field, I mean, that can be debated. In fact, I'm sure somebody out there has probably done the calculations on it and figured out exactly the right number of static fields cast in like a perfect rotation for an energy shield, Nova Sorceress. But it's not really all that serious. But any situation that you're in, being able to hit the entire screen and reducing 25% from literally everything nearby is just insanely powerful, and you shouldn't, avoid it. It's not something that you should just completely ignore out of your rotation. Nova Sorceresses are going to utilize everything within their disposal. And speaking of utilizing everything within your realm of disposal, another ability is Thunderstorm. So as a Nova Sorceress, you're forced to build Static Field, whether you want to or not. And this also means that you have the full synergy for Thunderstorm. And you can pretty much just 1-point wonder it. So if you're building down to Energy Shield anyway, which is what most Nova Sorceresses do, it's literally just 1 point. You just throw 1 point into Thunderstorm here, and now you have an ability that does 1,358 to 2,570 damage. It's a free use ability. You just spam it. So you just go outside, you're getting ready for your, you're doing your little pre-buff, and you cast your abilities. So, maybe you set up your pre-buff, something like this. You've got, like, frozen armor, right? So you probably got frozen armor in the mix. Chinchilla fur everywhere. So you do, like, F1, F2, F3, and then maybe you got, like, enchant on there, too. So you go out of town, and you just hit your pre-buff. And that's literally it. It's definitely worth 1 point for a pre-buff. I don't know if it's worth dumping points into because the damage output doesn't go insanely high. I think it caps out around like 5 or 6k, which isn't like super duper amazing. But it is free damage that you can just 1 point wonder and cast as a Nova Sorceress. Now, other sorceresses don't really have the same benefit because they don't always max out Static Field, and so they don't always have the right synergies, or they're not going down that side of the tree, or whatever's going on. So things are a little bit more interesting when it comes to those, 1 point wondering. You can always get it on a pre-buff staff. But if you are maxing out Lightning Mastery and you are maxing out Static Field anyway, it just makes an absolutely beautiful 1 point wonder. And that's the Nova Sorceress in a nutshell. She does massive amounts of damage to large groups of monsters. She does the same amount of damage to one monster, which doesn't really feel very good at all. When you're killing like 100 monsters on the screen at the same time with Nova, you feel like a god. You feel like the most powerful monster in all creation. But then you're doing the same amount of damage to one monster like Diablo, and you don't really feel as powerful anymore because you realize that, well, yeah, while you do lots of damage to large groups of monsters, you don't deal as much to the single target. So it's kind of like, eh. However, Nova Sorceresses have become very popular since it's been buffed. So if you guys are unaware of this, the synergy that was added to Nova Sorceress has buffed it up a little bit. There was also a huge change in the next hit delay. So for some reason or another, the way that Nova works, Nova was an ability that had multiple next hit delay events. So when you cast your first Nova, that Nova has a next hit delay event. And then when you cast your second Nova, that Nova also had a next hit delay event. And they were basically interfering with each other. So despite the fact that 200% Nova Sorceresses were casting, ridiculously fast, they weren't really dishing out the maximum amount of damage that they possibly could. Well, with the next hit delay changes, it seems like Nova is now capable of hitting a target twice on the way out, which is increased the damage, I think, by about 33%. So even though the damage output on the screen hasn't changed, the way that the damage applies to the monster has changed, and it has increased the effectiveness of Nova by a pretty large amount. So if you played the Nova Sorceress before the synergy change, and you played Nova Sorceress before the next hit delay changes, you might be surprised at the damage output that Nova Sorceress has now, because it's actually really damn good. And definitely worth a shot. But it does have a lot of problems that have to be overcome. Obviously, you have to overcome the high mana cost of the ability, and you have to overcome the fact that it doesn't really do very good single target damage, which can be an issue. It doesn't really have a very high point cost investment, though, and I think that's kind of important and something that we should talk about. It's really just 20 points here, 20 points here, and 20 points here, which is a total of 60 points for Nova. So if you are just building Nova and you're not focusing on anything else in any of the lightning skill or the trees, it is very easy to build this particular build as opposed to some of the others. Most notably is things like lightning, which requires 20, 40, 60, 80 to max out. And quite a few of the other abilities are like this, like Blizzard requires 20, 40, 60, 80, and 81 if you wanted to skimp, but like 100 if you didn't want to skimp. And like this is the kind of crazy stuff that goes on the Sorceress, is a lot of these things have just a ridiculously large number of synergies, which makes them very hard to build because you don't really have a huge number of skill points, you know, to take advantage of. But Nova, on the other hand, is one of the few abilities that does have very limited skill point investment. A lot like Charge Bolt, which also has the same limited skill point investment, which is 20, 40, 60. Anyway, as always, I'd appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos, even when we're just talking about Nova. And as always, keep watching.